Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, says Donald Trump is hoping for chaos by sending National Guard troops into Los Angeles to help quell protests against raids targeting undocumented migrants. The governor is urging demonstrators to stay peaceful, saying violence will only justify more crackdowns by the White House. Tonight, federal agents from the Department of Homeland Security clashed with protesters, while on social media, Mr. Trump said the demonstrators were led by radical left activists and they wouldn't be tolerated. Well, John Sudworth is live in Los Angeles for us tonight with our top story. John.
Well, you can see the National Guard members standing behind me. California National Guard, it says on their riot shields there. They've been deployed just as President Trump said they would. And on this side, you can see a crowd of a few hundred protesters. They've been shouting things like, "You work for us." And although it's been overwhelmingly peaceful throughout the afternoon, we have seen a bit of tension with tear gas volleys being fired on one occasion. And this crowd is furious at what they see as a major breach of precedent and protocol in American politics, overreached by the White House. The first time, Clive, in 60 years that the National Guard have been sent in to a US city without a specific request from a state government.
The National Guard on the streets of Los Angeles, here ostensibly to keep the order. But the deployment itself has caused a political storm. 2 days of protests have seen sometimes violent clashes between locals angry about immigration raids in the city and law enforcement using tear gas and rubber bullets. There have been a number of arrests. LA's mayor has called the decision to send in the National Guard unnecessary posturing. California's governor says it's pure political spectacle orchestrated by President Trump. But Mr. Trump insists that the troops are needed to restore the peace.
Well, we're going to have troops everywhere. We're not going to let this happen to our country. We're not going to let our country be torn apart like it was under Biden.
Even the city's police force, however, says the protests have so far been small and they don't need the extra help, with many residents also left baffled about why the National Guard has been sent in.
I think it's an intimidation tactic. I think it's trying to make sure that people don't come out and give protests. They don't come and protect their fellow citizens, their fellow community members.
They came trying to intimidate and scare us, and the community is saying no, and that's what caused people to be angry.
It's pretty obvious to most people, I would think, that this is their response to that. They don't like being criticized. Trump does not like being criticized, and this is how he has responded.
The protests were triggered by the arrests of dozens of immigrants. California is the world's fourth largest economy and relies on this workforce. Many Democratic politicians argue that those working without documents and who pay their taxes should be left alone. At one point, one group of protesters tried to stop a bus carrying some of those detained. But Mr. Trump, basking in a standing ovation at an Ultimate Fighting Championship match in New Jersey, insists he's fulfilling his mandate to crack down on illegal migration and that no one can be allowed to stand in the way.
John, things look relatively peaceful where you are, though tensions could, of course, shift. And how much of this situation is actually the result of a dreadful relationship between President Trump and the governor of California?
Well, what shifted in recent days and weeks, Clive, is the administration's targeting of immigrants has shifted from a focus on immigrants with criminal records, the sort of hardcore immigrants that Donald Trump promised to go after on the campaign trail, to what many see as much softer targets, the thousands and thousands of undocumented migrants who staff this country's farms and restaurants, and that these protesters say ought to be left well alone. Of course, Mr. Trump claims he has a mandate. Immigration was at the centre of his election campaign, but it is very clear that that tension you speak about, that was there long before these protests, is beginning to show in terms of that relationship between states like California and the White House. And there is no doubt that Democratic politicians like the Californian Governor Gavin Newsom believes that the National Guard are now being used as political pawns in all of this, purely for political effect.
All right, John, thanks for that. John Sudworth there, live in downtown LA.
The Prince of Wales has said that an urgent wake-up call is needed for what's going on with the planet's oceans. Speaking ahead of a UN conference on ocean protection, which is due to start in the southern French city of Nice on Monday, Prince William said it could no longer be a matter of out of sight, out of mind. Let's take a listen.
If we are to reach our goal, we urgently need to take bold action to protect and restore our planet. We must realize the potential of the blue economy for our ecosystems, our economies, and our communities. With creativity, ingenuity, investment, and support, we can unlock exciting innovations and solutions that protect our planet, create jobs, sustain livelihoods, and encourage prosperity. This challenge is like none that we have faced before. But I remain an optimist. I believe that urgency and optimism have the power to bring about the action needed to change the course of history. I'm an optimist because as the founder of the Earthshot Prize, I see the incredible examples of the ideas, innovations, and technologies that are harnessing the power of the ocean whilst protecting its vitality.
Prince William's full speech is available on our website, but here are a few of the points he made. He said that while the world's nations have committed to protecting 30% of the land and sea by the year 2030, so far only 17% of the land and just 3% of the ocean have been fully protected. He also noted three of the big issues affecting the oceans: rising temperatures, plastic pollution and overfishing. Our reporter Pierre-Antoine Denis was at the event at the Grimaldi Forum in Monaco for us. He gave me this analysis of Prince William's speech.
Yeah, so it was a very strong sense of urgency, but also optimism from the Prince of Wales there in this speech that was described as a landmark speech. And it's true that some of the words that we've been hearing were very, very strong in his call to action and this idea that we all in this together, wherever we are, whoever we are. For some, it's already an existential threat. For others, it is important to act because we owe it to the people who are already feeling the brunt of climate change. This is a very strong call, but also a call that's been repeated over and over again by both Prince William and King Charles over the years. And we've been hearing about how we need to act together with urgency and optimism while we still have the chance, because as I said, for some nations around the world, Pacific Islands, for instance, the threat of climate change and sea level rise is already just there to the extent that some are already thinking about drawing plans to relocate themselves as climate refugees. This is just one of the many issues that Prince William has touched upon. But he also looked at the optimism about the innovation that is around the different issues that surrounding our oceans and what can be done with the right incentives, but also the right funding.
And Pierre, he's of course speaking ahead of the UN Ocean Conference starting on Monday in Nice in France. What can we expect from the conference? What kind of commitments can we expect?
So there should be, by the end of this conference, hopefully by the beginning of it, according to the French officials, the full ratification of a treaty about the high seas. So it's to create some sort of governance around the international waters and protected marine areas to be increased considerably. There is this target that has been signed a few years ago around the idea that 30% of seas and protected land and close to marine life should be protected. At this stage, it's only 8%. So there's still a long way to go. And Prince William echoed that in that speech as well, about how this is the ambition, this is the target, but it needs to happen now. And there are real questions around this conference that kickstarts on Monday with, if Donald Trump isn't here, calling climate change a hoax, how can there be actual incentive and actual implementation and funding around these programs if the US isn't in it?
The Prince's speech comes a day after he released on his social media accounts his own interview with the veteran broadcaster Sir David Attenborough, in which they spoke about the future of the planet's seas. In today's speech, Prince William paid tribute to Sir David's new film Ocean, saying it made the most compelling argument for immediate action he has ever seen.
Watching human activity reduce beautiful sea forests to barren deserts at the base of our oceans is simply heartbreaking. For many, it is an urgent wake-up call to just what is going on in our oceans. But it can no longer be a matter of out of sight, out of mind. The need to act to protect our ocean is now in full view. As ever, Sir David leaves us with a sense of optimism that all is not lost. He believes change is possible. Put simply, the ocean is under enormous threat, but it can revive itself. But only if together we act now.
Chris Bowler is an oceanographer and a scientific director of the Tara Ocean Foundation. He's also in Monaco and gave me his reaction to Prince William's speech.
Yeah, well, the damage causing to the deep sea is very concerning, and what may potentially happen in the future is even more concerning. There's a lot of interest in deep sea mining, seabed mining, opening that up as soon as possible. There's a lot of damage being caused by bottom trawling due to industrial fishing. Oftentimes, these are done in areas beyond national jurisdiction, so-called the high seas. There is indeed a treaty being put in place that is currently being ratified, which we hope will protect those areas. But it's incredibly important that we give protection to these areas and perform more research to understand exactly what is happening in these high seas areas and what they do for the well-being of our entire planet. You know, just because the ocean is far away from our homes doesn't mean that the oceans don't affect our daily lives. They're in fact very important for regulating the climate, regulating the weather, and assuring the health, the well-being of the entire planet.
And at the end of this conference next week in Monaco, in Nice, we expect a political declaration to be signed by the countries attending. It's non-binding, but how could it be helpful for scientists like yourself?
Well, I mean, first of all, we have this, the fact that this ocean event is happening, organized by the UN, is a very clear sign that there is a realization of the urgency of the issue. There is important time being given to what the ocean does for the well-being of our planet, and there's also time being given to the biodiversity within the oceans and what biodiversity helps the oceans to perform. Most of that biodiversity is microscopic. It's the plankton, and it's those plankton that assure the health of the whole system. So there's a good urgent realization about this, and in many cases there really is scientific clarity on how things work and what we need to do to find solutions. Now what we need is political courage to stand up and really ensure that these actions are taken forward very urgently, very quickly, notably in the high seas, which are beyond, you know, the national jurisdictions. We need, you know, international programs to help address this urgent problem.
Now, NATO Secretary-General Mark Rutte has delivered a major speech on the alliance's plan to increase its defence spending. Mr. Rutte argued that member states would need to spend significantly more to maintain NATO's deterrent strength. The Kremlin has described the move as an instrument of aggression. Meanwhile, President Trump has long criticised NATO allies for relying too heavily on Washington and has been pushing for increased defence spending from European partners. Well, this is what Mark Rutte said while outlining the current priorities for the alliance.
At the summit in The Hague, I expect allied leaders will agree to spend 5% of GDP on defence. It will be a NATO-wide commitment and a defining moment for the alliance. There are two parts to this new defence spending plan. 3.5% will be invested in our core military requirements, while the rest will go towards defence and security-related investments, including infrastructure and building industrial capacity. Our decisions on defence spending are driven by NATO's battle plans and capability targets. They define what forces and capabilities allies need to provide. And last week, NATO defence ministers agreed ambitious new targets. The exact details are classified, but we need a 400% increase in air and missile defense. We see in Ukraine how Russia delivers terror from above. So we will strengthen the shield that protects our skies. Our militaries also need thousands more armored vehicles and tanks, millions more artillery shells. And we must double our enabling capabilities, such as logistics, supply, transportation and medical support.
Well, that was Mark Rutte. Let's speak now to our correspondent Rich Preston, who was listening to that speech at Chatham House. And Rich, that was fascinating how open Mark Rutte was, but he made that statement that European partners had to get to 5% of spending in terms of GDP. Did he give any sort of timeline on when that's actually achievable?
No, Matthew, he didn't, and he was pushed on that by our own defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale. Now, this is a wish list for Mark Rutte at the moment. The real decision will be made in 2 weeks' time when NATO leaders meet at their summit in The Hague, and that's when Mark Rutte is hoping that they will come to a firm agreement, not just on the 5%, but on the timeline. Now, he also said there was a bit of flexibility in that timeline. And one of the reasons that he said that is because, as you heard in his speech there, whilst 5% is the hard figure, it's kind of broken down. 3.5% into core defence spending, the usual bombs, bullets, tanks, submarines, etc., but 1.5% into defensive infrastructure. Now that means things like roads and rail and factories. And he pointed to Ukraine and used that as an example of a country that has recently had to move people and resources and munitions around very quickly in response to a threat. Now, some countries which are already NATO members, such as Finland and Sweden and Estonia, will look on this with a big smile on their face because collective security is a big part of their defence strategy already. Estonia already pledging to spend more than 5% of GDP on defence. So those countries looking at other European nations and NATO allies saying, well, we're glad you're going to finally be doing it the way that we've been doing it for some time. And Mark Rutte saying that this is really the important part of what NATO needs to be for the future. It needs to be stronger, fairer and more lethal because Russia is a threat to us and in the next 3 to 5 years could launch an attack on a NATO country.
Yes, Rich, he pointed to the threat obviously from Russia but also spoke about the threat from China. Now, Ukraine has, from the last NATO summit gathering, was put on an irreversible path to joining NATO. The Secretary-General was asked about the summit that we have in 2 weeks' time. What was his answer on that?
Well, it's a difficult one because NATO, of course, is a military alliance. It's not a political group. And as you mentioned in your introduction, Russia calls NATO the aggressor. It says NATO is the provocation. Now, many NATO members want Ukraine to be in the alliance, but there are some outliers in there, including the likes of Hungary and its leader Viktor Orban. This is something that's been chewed over for many years and frankly will continue to be chewed over for many years. Mark Rutte said that what gives the alliance its strength is the way it works things out democratically in the face of this Russian aggression. And as you mentioned earlier as well, not just Russia, China, Iran and North Korea, a group that he described as the awful foursome.
Rich, thanks very much. And of course, in terms of Ukraine joining NATO, the view from the White House also absolutely critical. More on that here in the next little while around the world and across the UK. You're watching BBC News.